Hi, everybody. Welcome to Talk About Tuesday. I am super excited because we have an amazing artist here. He is the Associate Professor for Sculpture at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. His name is Nestor Armando Gil. So thank you for joining us today. Hi, how are you doing?
My pleasure. Hello, nice to see you. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. So I just had some questions about, I was watching another interview that you had done recently where you were talking about sculpture as kind of this evolving form where it's not just a stagnant image that you're interacting with, but we're getting into this idea of extended media. Do you think you could talk on that for a few minutes?
Yeah, sure. So sculpture has always been a thing that you have to move through time in order to experience it. So if you're looking at a painting or a drawing, you can stand in one place and you can see the whole thing, right? Unless it's been drawn or painted on the back. But typically you can see the whole thing. With sculpture, even traditional sculpture, static objects, you still have to walk all the way around the thing in order to see all of it. And walking around the thing means that time is passing while you experience it. And you have to move to different places to see the entire thing because it can't be seen from just one place. And so extended media sort of picks up where that idea leaves off. And it includes things like performance art and video and installation art, where you walk into a space or a room and it's been completely changed by an artist, and there may not be a sculpture in the room, but the room itself has become the sculpture and you move through it as a viewer. So there's all kinds of ways that sculpture, it's moved into the digital world. It's sort of because you have to walk around it, and it's time-based. When video came along, and video is time-based because it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, it kind of naturally fit with sculpture, where it didn't really fit with painting, even though you would think that it did because they're both like flat images. But the movement through time is something that paintings don't do and sculptures do. And so extending the media of sculpture into digital and video and performance is kind of natural because, another example is that when we do performance, we use our bodies and our bodies are three-dimensional. And so like a sculpture, right? And so when you do performance, you're kind of making the sculpture your body, and it's a sculpture that moves.
That's wonderful.
So yeah.
That's really cool.
I like teaching it.
Yeah, that's really cool. It's kind of mixing that the classic forms of sculpture and form with the modern tools, the ability to, reach into the digital age and pull that into like the synergy of the two.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I mean the digital age is really important because a lot of times the main way we see art is on a screen these days, right? I mean, we might go to museums, we might see sculptures there, but more often we might see them on a screen. And so, making sculpture that functions as a two-dimensional image as well is a particular challenge in the 21st century, right? So it creates interesting opportunities for sculptors to think about how their work can exist in the internet, for example.
That's wonderful. I love that you're taking that question of how do we make this relevant, and you're really coming up with answers for it.
We're trying.
Yeah. That's really cool. Okay, so a lot of your work is kind of a commentary on your culture and immigration. How do you think that your cultural identity influences your work as an artist?
Well, it's one of those things. That's a great question. It's one of those things that I can't escape it. I can't get away from my cultural identity. It's just fundamentally who I am. I can't, there's not a time that I wake up and I'm not Cuban. There's not a time that, I wake up and I'm not male. There's not a time that I wake up and I'm not, the child of immigrants, right? And those experiences in the world, they form and they shape your thinking and your mind and the way that you feel about things in a particular way. So, really it's hard for me to think about making art that doesn't include my identity, since the identity that's making the art is me, right? And that doesn't mean I only ever make work about immigration or about like cultural, tension, in the United States. Uh, Sometimes I may make work that has to do with entirely other things, but my identity is still in that work, right? Like somehow it's impossible to escape me, and so somewhere in the piece is me. Now, the work that is really on purpose about that, yeah, it tries to use materials that have something to do with my cultural heritage, like tobacco that I boil down to make a tea, and I use that to stain paper, or sugar cane that I pulp down. I break it down into a pulp, and then I turn that pulp into paper, and then I press that paper into castings, into sculptures, inner tubes, because a lot of people who tried to get away from islands in the Caribbean have used inner tubes as a way to float. And so they build boats or rafts, and the flotation device is a big truck inner tube, like you might use to float down a river for fun. And so I use that material, and I cut it up into pieces and weave it into blankets, and just try to keep working with it, try to keep dealing with it, figure out how this material can change and do something new for me. I, make a net out of it, braid it, who knows? Always trying to experiment to see what these materials that already have meaning for me can do physically.
That's wonderful. So that's a great segue into another question I had, which would be, can you just maybe walk us through perhaps the can't get there from here, the dragnet?
Yeah, for sure. That piece was actually kind of a direct response to something that was happening in the country last year. There were a couple of incidents, and one in particular when authorities made a giant gesture of rounding up people whose citizenship status was in question, and you know in a dragnet, right? Like wrapping them all up and taking them in, and starting, proceedings to see who was going to be deported and who wasn't. And these things happened a couple of times last year. And after the largest one happened, it affected me emotionally, because I have friends and family who are living that experience, of course. And so those grubs, the pieces that are caught up in that net, which is made of inner tube, that's a net made out of inner tube. What we do is we take the inner tube and we cut it in a spiral so that we can get really long strips. And then those long strips, we weave those into a net. And then the grub looking forms that some people say look like yams and some people say look like cocoons, those are basically a pattern printed from an inner tube that I made a collage with. So I put ink on the inner tube and ran it through the press. And then the pattern, I put that into the computer, and I made those pillows have that pattern on them. I basically screen printed that pattern onto both sides of the pillow. And then we sewed them into pillows and filled them with black beans and rice, which is like a typical food that Cuban people eat. And so and also other Latino people and Latinx people. Let me remember that. There's a feeling in that work of being caught up and unable to get clear. And so the title, Can't Get There From Here, is actually a reference to an old song from the 80s and just to an old saying, right? When you're in a place that just seems so far away and so remote that there doesn't seem to be a clear path to anywhere where there's something going on. People might say, like you say, hey, how do you get to Chicago? And they'd say, oh, you can't get there from here. And so that saying is kind of being used in this title in kind of a sad or tragic way. To talk about people who are just trying to make a move and it's being made more difficult for them by the powers that be.
That's really a powerful statement, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. Would you be able to talk a little bit about the work Boca as well, the tobacco?
Yeah, that's a performance piece. I'm glad that you asked about that. That piece is really a tribute to my father. When you're the child of immigrants, they have a tendency, your parents, your elders, not just your parents, but all the elders of your, from your community of Cuban people, in my case, they're always, as you're growing up, they're always telling you all of these stories about a place that they tell you is home, even though you've never been there. And they also always tell you that this place where you were born and live isn't really home, because home is this other place. And those stories that they tell you include like stories about what makes that home place great, or what makes it beautiful. And so in a way, they kind of force feed you with those stories. They don't mean to. They're proud of their culture and they want you to be proud of it too. But they, it's like, and you absorb it and you love it, but you also can't possibly breathe under the weight of it, right? You suddenly feel like there's an identity you're supposed to have, but it's not clear to you. And so those materials are four materials. One is ground up tobacco, because tobacco is like a national, really important national crop in Cuba. Cuban cigars are particularly famous all over the world. Another is sand from a beach in Cuba. The beautiful beaches, one of the things that makes a place attractive as a geographical location. Another is sugar being like the main crop that kept Cuba going forever, like from colonial times all the way up until the fall of the Soviet Union. And the last one is coffee, because café cubano is like, there's a particular culture of Cuban coffee, right? Like there's a particular culture of Greek or Turkish coffee. And Cuban coffee is, kind of like motor oil, but also sort of ridiculously sweet. and so, those four ingredients, those four materials are, I lay on the ground, and those materials are poured into my open mouth until it's overflowing and overflowing, and I can't take it anymore. And then the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one. And it's really a metaphor, right, for that experience of mythologies. In fact, there's the title of that piece, kind of after it, there's in parentheses, your memories are my myths. And it's kind of a direct statement to my dad that all these things he remembers are just sort of fantasy stories to me that I can't really understand.
That's awesome. Are there any other pieces that you'd like to share with us, you'd like to talk about right now?
I think that some of the pieces that I've shared with you in terms of images include, pieces that look like inner tubes, but but are made out of sugarcane, or pieces that look like inner tubes but are made out of plaster that I've stained with tobacco ink, right? The brown inner tubes. It's just, I think the main thing that I'd point at is that the materials are really important. When you're talking about sculpture, you're not just talking about what does the thing look like, but also what's it made of. And there's this artist named Anish Kapoor, and I don't think he's necessarily the nicest person in the world, but he is a pretty great artist. And he said once that sculpture occupies the same space as your body. And I think that that's the main thing. It's hard to see it all the time when you're looking at images, on a computer screen, but that these things are meant to be understood as a reflection of the scale of your body. And that when you're standing next to it, the size of you is the tool that you use to measure that thing, right? So, if you're somewhere and there's a sculpture, remember that your body is the yardstick. Stand near it. How much bigger? How much smaller is it? Can you get your arms around it? Would you have to walk? How far would you have to walk to get around it? Those ideas about the relationship between that thing and your body is the beginning. That's the place where you break past the object and into that expanded field that we were talking about earlier.
That's awesome. So that's a great segue as well into what advice would you have for the younger generation if they want to maybe pursue art?
So, I used to think that my job was to tell young people who want to pursue art, yeah, you can do it. Be creative, draw a lot, write a lot of poems, do your best and make beautiful things, and, try and try and try. And I mean, I think that's a good way to think about it. That's the way I want to be. I want to just be always a cheerleader for young artists, because that's what that kind of encouragement is what we think that young artists need. But then I think about myself when I was young, and the struggles of no one encouraging it at all. No one finding any value in a poem that I wrote, or in a drawing that I did, or a song that I made. And I wasn't raised in a family that really understood that those things could mean something. And the thing is that the more that I teach art, the more I realize that the young artists, the people who want to be artists, they don't need my encouragement. They don't need your encouragement, even though we're art teachers and we want to encourage them. And we do, because we love art and we want to get them to love art. They don't need that, though. The ones who are really going to do it, they could have people every day telling them that it's worthless and that they should stop and that it'll never get them anywhere. But the artists are the ones who do it anyway. And the poets are the ones who do it anyway. And the songwriters are the ones who do it anyway. And those are the ones. You don't have to have the encouragement. The encouragement is great. It feels good. It makes our ego bubble. But the people who do it anyway, whether they're encouraged or not, that's the fire.
That's freaking awesome. Yeah, I love that. I absolutely love that. Well, thank you. So I have one last question, and it's just kind of a little fun one that I like to do. What is your favorite tool to use when creating art?
Oh, that's a great one. I think I don't want to sound like I'm being silly with this answer.
Oh no, there's no silly answer.
Yeah, but I think that the greatest tool that you have is it is yourself. It is resourcefulness. It is your mind. I've been teaching sculpture online for the second half of this semester. And in the studio, before we went to online teaching, everybody had hammers and chisels and plaster and wood and saws. We had all kinds of stuff to make all kinds of stuff with. And then we went home, and sculpture became an online class. And that sounds wild, but really it opened up so many opportunities for my students to think about materials in new ways that plaster in the sculpture studio wasn't letting them experiment with. What could I do with an old t-shirt? What could I do with pots and pans? And so, if I had to pick a tool that isn't the mind, I would say the sketchbook and the pencil are the most important tools of any artist. And I don't mean because you have to draw. It doesn't matter if you draw. The sketchbook and the pencil, because that sketchbook is where you put everything before it's anything. And so that's an important tool to have. I think that ideas are the most important material. I think they're the most important medium. Some people work in stone, some in metal, some in oil paint, some in watercolor, but they all work with ideas or their work is no good. And so ideas, your brain, a sketchbook and a pencil, and you're off to the races.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I think that was a wonderful interview, and I'm sure the kids are going to love it.
Well, it's a real pleasure. And it's just wonderful to see a former student where I used to teach just killing it, doing great in life. I love it.
Oh, thank you so much. It was really nice to check in with you, and I really appreciate you doing this.
Sure. Hey, if you produce this thing in any kind of form that you can share back to me, I would appreciate it.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Great.
Awesome. Yay. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.